Hello there, fellow wood enthusiasts and casual observers of economic chaos. Today we're diving headfirst into the wild, wacky world of lumber prices. Buckle up because it's been a real roller coaster ride. Remember those halcyon pre-pandemic days when you could buy a 2x4 without needing a small loan? Pepperidge Farm remembers. Then, bam! The pandemic hit, and suddenly everyone and their uncle decided they needed a home office, a new deck, or maybe just a meticulously crafted toothpick dispenser. Demand for lumber skyrocketed, sending prices into the stratosphere. But what goes up must come down. Eventually, the lumber bubble burst and prices plummeted back to earth. So what the heck happened? Why did lumber prices go bonkers? And what's in store for the future? Stick around and we'll break it all down for you. Remember those early days of lockdown when we were all baking sourdough bread, perfecting our banana bread recipes, and desperately trying to avoid our roommates, spouses, children, and parents? Well, it turns out that all that time cooped up at home had a surprising side effect, a massive surge in home improvement projects. People weren't just baking bread, they were building decks, adding bedrooms, and finally tackling those long-neglected DIY projects. With everyone stuck at home, spending on home renovations went through the roof. And guess what? All those ambitious DIYers needed lumber. Lots and lots of lumber. This surge in demand caught the lumber industry off guard. Sawmills, which had scaled back production during the early days of the pandemic, suddenly couldn't keep up. It was the perfect storm, skyrocketing demand and limited supply, creating a recipe for, you guessed it, insane price increases. Now let's talk about why sawmills were caught so off guard by the surge in demand. Like many industries, the lumber industry experienced major supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. Lockdowns, labor shortages, and transportation bottlenecks all threw a wrench into the works. Remember those images of container ships backed up at ports? Yeah, that wasn't just happening with flat-screen TVs and sweatpants. Lumber shipments were also delayed, further constricting supply. And as anyone who's ever taken a basic economics course knows, or anyone who's tried to buy toilet paper in a pandemic, when supply goes down and demand goes up, prices go through the roof. And we're not talking about a small bump in prices here. Lumber prices went absolutely bonkers, hitting record highs in 2021. A piece of lumber that might have cost a few bucks pre-pandemic was suddenly going for 10 times that amount. It was enough to make even the most seasoned contractor weep into their tool belt. Section 4. The crash lumber prices come down to earth. Remember that lumber bubble we mentioned earlier? Well, like all bubbles, it eventually burst. By 2022, lumber prices had come crashing back down to earth, much to the relief of DIYers and home builders everywhere. But what went down? Several factors contributed to the lumber price crash. First, demand started to cool off. As the pandemic eased and people started venturing outside their homes again, those ambitious home renovation projects lost some of their urgency. Plus, with inflation rearing its ugly head, people were starting to tighten their belts and think twice about expensive renovations. Second, supply chain issues started to ease. Remember those container ships stuck at ports? Well, they eventually started moving again and lumber shipments began to flow more freely. Sawmills also ramped up production, further boosting supply. With demand cooling and supply increasing, it was only a matter of time before prices came down. Section 5. Interest rates and the housing market slowdown. Of course, no discussion of lumber prices would be complete without mentioning the housing market. As you know, the housing market has been on a tear in recent years, with low interest rates fueling a surge in demand. But now, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to combat inflation, and that's putting the brakes on the housing boom. As interest rates rise, mortgages become more expensive, and fewer people can afford to buy homes. This slowdown in the housing market is bad news for the lumber industry, as new home construction is a major driver of lumber demand. So, while lumber prices have come down from their pandemic highs, the cooling housing market could put downward pressure on prices in the months to come. It's a classic case of supply and demand, folks. When demand for new homes is strong, demand for lumber is strong, and prices go up. But when demand for new homes weakens, so does demand for lumber, and prices come down. It's the circle of economics, and it moves us all. Section 6. Oversupply and the future of lumber prices. So, what does the future hold for lumber prices? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, demand for lumber is expected to remain relatively weak in the near term, as the housing market cools and consumers grapple with inflation. On the other hand, the lumber industry is grappling with an oversupply problem. Remember how sawmills ramped up production to meet that surge in pandemic demand? Well, now that demand has cooled, there's too much lumber sloshing around. This oversupply is putting downward pressure on prices, and some analysts believe that lumber prices could fall even further in the coming months. Of course, predicting the future of lumber prices is a bit like predicting the weather. There are a lot of factors at play and things can change quickly. But one thing is for sure, the lumber market is in a state of flux, and we can expect more volatility in the months and years to come.